Okay, welcome everybody to another webinar of sampling grain, why, when, and where. I just want to thank everybody joined so far, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have continued to do this on a regular basis with the webinars. So again, I just want to say thank you. Before we get started, I want to just emphasize a little bit that we're going to be talking more specifically on our AgriDry products with the sampling the grain, as far as like our sampler tube and auger and stuff. I realize there's a lot of different types of sampling grain, as far as like on a flatbed, or probe sampling or tailgate sampling, and there's tons and tons of literature and stuff on that, and probably I would not be the best person to go over that today. So what we're going to do is just kind of stick to our AgriDry products as we know it, and explain the ins and outs of sampling grain with our sampler tube and auger. So we talk about why, okay? There is absolutely no substitute for proper grain management other than, obviously, you, the customer, taking the necessary steps in managing your grain. And that's pretty much self-explanatory. It's self-explanatory because, you guys, you can make or break the difference on a lot of this stuff. So nothing can replace you as a customer and doing that yourself. So this is kind of an informational webinar that you guys can understand how to do this better. All right. So sampling grain can be the easiest way and yet most cost-effective way to manage a grain as well. Proper sampling should be done throughout the whole bin, the top, middle, and bottom. With our grain sampler tube, a lot of you probably may already have a sampler tube that we have supplied you with, and you've already been familiar with what it looks like. But a lot of times they go in the bottom. We're going to talk about how they can also go maybe in the middle, and on a bigger commercial bin setup, they can go higher up as well. I'm just going to wait a little bit here, screen to load. It's also important that you test your grain sample with not just your sampler and your testing equipment, but also the elevator you'll be selling it at. Just be sure, that you guys are at the same moisture reading. So, a lot of you guys probably have your own testing equipment, or you can get a sample and test your sample, but you also want to also test that with the co-op or wherever you're going to be selling it at, so make sure you're pretty close to the same reading. And that's why we always say trust and verify. It's not that we don't trust our stuff, but we just want to verify it with whoever we're going to be selling it at, because obviously they're the end user, and they're going to be the ones that make or break that decision. So keep that in mind as well. As far as when to take a sample, you should always take a sample when you are dumping in the grain, unless you already know the moisture content, either from your tractor, combine, or other type of equipment that you have. Sometimes I've talked to a couple of different farmers. I know that there's a lot of newer equipment out there on the combines that actually tell you what you're coming in at when you're combining it. So also, you'll want to take a sample when you start to run the fans, either for drying or moisturizing, so you have a baseline current moisture content reading. This is going to be ideal for setting up the parameters of our AgriDry bullseye system. So if you have a bullseye on your bin, what you do is, usually when you're dumping in there, if you haven't already taken a sample and you don't really know, and you got a kind of a mixture in there, you want to test and pull a sample from there to see where you're at, so you can put in your baseline on your current moisture on the AgriDry Bullseye controller. It's also recommended, a lot of times if you call in, we take a sample every 20 hours of actual fan run time. This isn't just 20 hours of idle time. This is based on the controller, and you can actually see the fan run time on the AgriDry Bullseye controller. That way you can see what is, how many hours have actually been on the controller itself. So even though it might have been 2 days, depending on the conditions outside and the conditions of the grain, you may only have 10 or 15 hours of fan run time. So that's why we say pull a sample every 20 hours of actual fan run time to see where the process is going and how much you've got it. Soybeans usually don't take as long to dry. You can see a difference, and with that, corn might take a little longer because it's not as susceptible. It doesn't change as much. So that's just the baseline of that. So also, when using the AgriDry Bullseye controller for storage mode, you'll also want to sample the grain moisture content at the start of storage mode. It's also recommended to take a sample approximately every week just to make sure the grain is maintaining moisture content. You want to watch the fan runtime hours to see how much the fans have actually ran in storage mode. For example, if a week of storage, after storage in the storage mode, you look at the controller and there's only 10 hours of actual fan runtime, you may not need to take a sample that day or at all. Again, you want to base this on the fan runtime hours and see where you're at. Most of the time in storage mode, you're really not going to change the moisture that much, just because in storage mode, the whole purpose of storage mode is not to really change it. It's just to maintain where you're at and keep that and hold that till you're ready to sell it or until conditions change. So next we're going to be talking about the installation of the sampler tube and auger, crank and auger. You can see here that you want to mount about 3 feet above the grain bin floor. Mounting should be done somewhere that is easy to get to, usually somewhere close to the Bullseye controller. Our installers usually will, a lot of times, place it in between the controller and like your manhole ladder. If you have a staircase, sometimes they like to put it at the bottom of the staircase. There really is no wrong place to mount it other than make sure it's at least above 3 feet above the floor, and that way, and it's not in the way of like the inside manhole ladder. So that's something else to keep in mind because you don't want it being snagged on. These can also be mounted in the bin that are empty or full. Preferably empty because there's you can actually secure the bolts better in both sides of it. But you have when we ship these out to you, you'll have the appropriate hardware that you can do it either empty or full. If the bin is empty, you want to mount with 4, 5, 16 by 3/4 hex bolts and serrated nuts which are supplied in the shipping. If the bin is full, you can mount with 4 self-tapping screws that are supplied. As far as drilling for the hole, use a 1 7/8" hole saw to mount that, so it goes in there nicely. You don't want a lot of slack, but an 1 7/8" should be perfect size. And then after it's been installed, you want to use clear silicone to seal around the flat top and the 3 sides and around the tube where it is welded on the flat plate, leaving the bottom open to allow moisture to escape. So if you're looking at that picture on the top right there of the actual sampler tube, you would want to fill that silicone in where those ribs go in and out and up and down. and you want to fill the silicone on the sides of that and the top of that. You can leave a little bit underneath, unseal the silicone, so, like I said, moisture can escape a little bit. And also, obviously, the instructions will all be, we'll have instructions mailed in with the sampler tube and auger. This next picture just kind of goes in a little bit more detail. You'll see where the wavy lines are actually supposed to represent the ribs, the high side of the ribs on the bin. Notice that you'll want to make sure that when you put in your bolt holes and fasten these screws in, you want to make sure those screws are going on the high side of the rib. And that's just going to make for it to seal better, and it's not going to pull any unnecessary tension on the plate itself or the rib of the bin. And then you can, obviously, after that's mounted and fastened, you can do that seal it with silicone around the sides. So obviously this diagram just shows that you can do vertical mounting or horizontal mounting of the sampler tube, just depending on the corrugation of the ribs on the bin, if they're a wide ring or a 44-inch wide ring, depending on what you got. So this next slide you guys should see is wear. I've got arrows pointing on the bins. You can see kind of on this is a staircase, a wraparound. It's a smaller farm bin, but what you can see is on that middle arrow, you'll see that there's a sampler tube that's actually installed halfway up. And you can put it there. I mean, I see a lot of times farmers will want it wrapped around on their staircase. That's ideal, good access. And then obviously the most two important places for sampling is on the bottom and on the top. And you're not necessarily going to put a sampler tube up top, but obviously just check it through the manhole at the top of the staircase. The most important two, again, are at the bottom, because that's where the fan is going to do most of its drying at. It's the source of where it's drying at. It's going to push all the moisture up through. And then you want to test it up top so you can see where the moisture, if the moisture has been pushed through or not yet. In the middle, you can obviously just check for reference as well. This next one is a picture of a commercial bin. And the same thing applies, even though this doesn't have a staircase. A lot of the newer construction bins will have platforms on these bins, and these are also good locations that you can use to put a sampler tube if you would like to, as far as pulling a sample there and testing it. Again, this is just extra stuff that you guys can use. Doesn't necessarily have to be done that way, but these are just some suggestions that you can use to get a better sample throughout the whole bin. So this is in a video. It actually shows how to take a sample using our sampler tube. Okay, so here's the demonstration of how to pull a sample. And you're going to see that the end there, obviously you're just going to take that cap off on that yellow cap. And then you'll want to make sure you also have a bucket so you obviously can catch the grain as well. Pretty self-explanatory. So you push the crank in, and then you just crank it depending on how big of a sample you want. And you can see that once you get the desired amount, stick a bucket in there, and then you can just start pulling that back out. And as you're cranking that, you'll actually start to feel and see the grain coming through the auger, that little auger. And once you've got enough, again, pull straight out, catch it in the bucket, and then that is essentially how to pull a sample. Not too hard. The rest of the video there you'll see is just showing that there's more locations you can do up top as well. Just kind of waiting for it to buffer. I see some of it might be lagging a little bit, so we're just trying to Restart there. Okay, so there again, we're going to talk about do's and don'ts of grain sampling. Some people have asked, we've had in different conversations with people on whether it be tech support or whatever, about testing the same sample twice, and we say don't, because every time you take a sample of that same sample, the more times you take it, it's gonna change that, and it's not gonna be the same reading. The reason for that is something to do with the electricity. When it comes through there, it changes the resistance in the water or something, and it just happens to change that sample. So make sure you don't take the same sample twice. Don't test it more than once. You can pull a different sample, obviously a fresh sample, and check it again, but don't test the same sample twice. Going back to the crank and auger, don't leave the sample tube filled with grain. A lot of times I've seen customers where they'll actually, instead of pulling that whole auger out, in that video you've probably seen that there was a small hole there where the auger, you can actually draw grain out using the auger, and the only problem with that is when you do that, it tends to leave mold and creates mold inside that tube, and you just don't want to have any kind of mold in there. So you want to make sure the sample tube is as empty as possible, and by pulling that auger straight out when you got your sample, your desired sample, that will fix that, alleviate that. Also, don't leave the auger in the sample tube or outside. This is just obviously preventative maintenance, so it doesn't get rusted, and so it works, and you can use it fully functionally. Under the do's, make sure you put the yellow cap seal back on the end of the sample tube. Again, this is just to alleviate any kind of moisture getting back inside the bin. You don't want to leave any unopened holes. Take enough grain out of the sample tube for as many tests as you require for sampling. And then also remove the auger from the sample tube to catch the grain. So a lot of these are just kind of self-explanatory. And is there any other questions that you guys have? I think what we're going to do is open up the line here so you guys can.
The lines are now open.
Yeah, my name is Milton Kane, and I have a question.
Hi, Bill.
Yes, sir, I have a sampling tube, but as the bin has emptied several times, it's bending the tube down. Have you had that problem before, or is there anything to do about that?
We have heard that. There is a brace that you can get installed to help keep that from doing that.
Yeah.
Yep. So.
Yeah, and that's we're also working on something else. Obviously, we're doing some more testing on that because it's just some of them do, some of them don't. It just kind of depends on the size of the bin, the type of bin, and the amount of grain or whatever that's in there. So we have seen that some do and some don't.
Dalmatian.
But yeah, and they're pretty durable. I mean, obviously you can probably bend them back and whatnot, and but like I said, we are looking to see if we can come up with something to maybe brace that or to help that so it doesn't bend as much. So, any other questions?
I got a question about the spreader.
Okay.
What's a good way to clean the fins on the spreader? You've got a long distance there from the center hole on top. and it's high from the floor. I don't have a ladder to get me up there. What's a good device to use to get that grain that wants to hang up in those fins without bending the fins?
So what we usually recommend doing is after, I mean, obviously, you know, those spreader chutes hang quite a ways down and throughout the top of that roof. So what we recommend is after you build it, you know, once the bin is full, like your first initial fill, you can crawl in there if it's close to the top, you know, get that peaked up closer. You can actually clean them from after every use. You go up top and, you know, go across the grain and clean them and get the beeswax and all the fines and stuff out of those tabs and the fins. Otherwise, you can actually, you know, if you've got like a long pole or some, you know, makeup kind of like a piece of conduit or something at the end of it, like a scraper, you can clean out the hopper and stuff with that.
The beetle.
So, did that kind of answer your question a little bit, or did you understand what I'm getting at?
I understand that. The problem is I can't get my bin full enough to get up there. I haven't had enough good crops to get my bin full.
Yeah. Other than that, I mean, it's sometimes you can reach some of them with if you get like a long pole, you know, and like a, you know, to try to get those out. But I realize that without, you know, to go all the way down the chute, depending on the size of spreader you have, I'm assuming your spreader has 8-foot chutes on it.
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, it's really going to be kind of hard unless you know, get a good crop and you get that bin full. So I guess, you know, do the best you can with it. Otherwise, obviously, the only other way to do it would be to lower it down to the floor, but that's not really practical. And, I mean, usually you can get the majority of stuff cleaned out. The main thing we recommend on the spreaders is just to get that hopper cleaned out. As far as getting like the leveling band and all that, like the old grain that sits in there from after each use, especially after the end of the harvest, and you want to definitely clean that out because by spring that stuff's going to be really moldy and nasty, and it's not gonna really benefit you or the spreader that much to have all that extra, you know, crud in the hoppers and, you know, in the leveling band and stuff like that. So that's really the best thing to do. The most important is to be cleaning the hopper out and the leveling band right there at the center shaft, right there below the opening of the center of the bin.
Okay.
Any other questions that we have?
Yeah, I had another question. Or do you feel like that sampling from the tube, just from the edge, that's only, 2 feet out into the bin, that's good enough? Or could you still have hot spots and stuff, other places in the bin that your sampling tube don't pick up?
It's a very good question. I'm glad you mentioned that because ideally, again, when I said earlier this morning, we were kind of pertaining it to our products. And the reason why our sampler tube only goes in like 2 to 3 feet in is because with conjunction of the gravity grain spreader that we have, the AgriDry spreader, it's going to eliminate all your fine content, and it's going to spread it evenly throughout the bin, and it's going to get that bin nice and level. And with that in mind, you wouldn't need to get a sample in the middle, and you wouldn't have, you know, any hot spotting in the middle per se with that. Now, if you do not have our AgriDry grain spreader and the bin is not necessarily level, you know, these are some other things you need to take into to context because, you know, obviously the air, you know, as far as the air is going to move with the least resistance. So if you've got a low side in that bin and you run these fans, the air is going to move through that low side of that grain pile. So the high side of the high pile of the grain, you know, may not have as much air going through it. It may not be dry, and the sample may be different. So that's why we recommend, you know, having if you've got one of our grain spreaders, that's great, because that'll help alleviate and spread the fine content evenly throughout the bin. Now, that's why it's only about 2 feet in, 'cause essentially the grain moisture and the grain conditions should be the same all the way around.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions?
Okay, if we don't hear any more questions, I just want to, again, wrap up and say thank you again for everything that you guys have done and tuning in all the time, each month or whatever, several times a month. And I want to thank you for the time that we can share with you on that. If you guys have thought about more, maybe some more questions here later on, in the days to come, feel free to call us if you have, and maybe there's other questions besides the sampler tube, maybe if a controller issue or whatever. Myself and Glenn Lewis is here to help at that number, 419-459-4399, for any kind of tech support. Also, if you have any other issues, we got other people here as well that can help with, whether it be a sale or whatever you might have. So I just want to say thanks again. It's been a pleasure, and make sure you tune in for more webinars here to come in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.